It's a great pleasure to be here, and one of the great things about doing this kind of work and talking to people who are not scientists but are certainly trying to apply some of the lessons of science is the questions that I often get, which are much ruder and more penetrating than the ones that you get from other academics who are afraid that one day I might be refereeing their paper. So David asked me to in part to tell a story about where I come from. This is not where I was born, this is CERN. But I come from the physical sciences, and the physical sciences, we just killed it, right? For the last 500 years, we were the prediction machines. Everything we thought was going to be true about the world basically came true, as David's wonderful example from the negative sign in Dirac's equation predicting the existence of an entire sort of parallel universe of matter just from a single equation that he trusted enough to follow through. There are a few great examples of this failing, the failure of mathematics to work in physics, and they're sort of so famous that in fact, they deserve footnotes in textbooks. So one of the classic ones is SU5. So they thought they had the final symmetry of everything. And the paper that was written was so arrogant that when it turned out to be false, it's now quoted in all the quantum field theory textbooks. But as we learned when we turned from the physical sciences to the social sciences, prediction becomes much harder, but it doesn't just become harder, it becomes an entirely different beast altogether. Don Farmer mentioned Laplace's demon. Laplace's demon is the sort of god of physics who can see the initial conditions of the universe and using his godlike powers evolve them forward in time to predict everything that happens next. So I encountered Laplace's demon after our sort of resident grouchy genius, Nate Matheny at the Santa Fe Institute, built for me a set of machines to do parallel processing. And what I did was I had written some code on my laptop. I tested it. I knew it worked. And I put it on the mainframe. And it ran. And it started running and running. And then it would stop mysteriously. And the thing would seize up. And I would sort of, fine, I would stop it, I'd bring it back to my laptop, I'd run it, and then it would run just fine. I would did this over and over and over again until I realized what was happening. And there was a part in my code where I needed random numbers. And I was doing a kind of algorithm that is now very popular, and we'll see a little bit later in this talk. It's an algorithm that people use to play the game of Go. This is how we've managed to beat our fellow humans at Go using machines, in part by making stochastic decisions about what to do next. Right? About trying to make the next step you take in your search space unpredictable. And it turns out that can be a very helpful thing to do. And so in order for my machine to do that, it needed a source of random numbers. And so in order to start that process off, it had to read from this device that's called /dev/random. It's like the hard drive, this sort of metaphorical hard drive that sits on your computer, and you can read from it. The problem is that I had a very conservative machine. And if I read a number off of dev/random, it then discarded it and wouldn't let me get that number again. So the code is running, and it's getting random numbers from dev/random, and then the machine runs out of randomness. Because, of course, the machine itself is totally deterministic. It knows that it can't use anything internal to itself as a source of randomness, because it's entirely predictable to itself. So the only source of randomness that it has, actually, is my interaction with it. And in fact, dev/random on this mainframe, and this is true for a lot of mainframes, the only time it fills up with random bits is when I log in and type something, and it uses the timing of my keystrokes and the timing of the packets that come in and out of the machine as its source of randomness. And so, essentially, this thing would run until it ran out of the randomness that I had given to it, the unpredictability I had given to it, right? And then it would stop, and it would try to read from dev/random, and it would just sit there, unable to do anything more until I logged in to see what was going wrong, and then I actually gave it a little bit of randomness to keep going. Okay? So, of course, in one sense, right, I'm not random either. But from the point of view of the machine, I am. The machine knows everything about itself. It's an incredibly well-engineered machine. Thank you, Nate, right? It has no source of noise. It's not going to randomly flip a bit, right? Everything that happens internal to itself is predictable to itself, right? And so if I come in from the outside, even if I'm predictable to something outside the machine doesn't care because it doesn't know who I am, right? So this helps me understand a really puzzling fact about the history of probability, because I delved into this a little bit. I said, when did we first get good at probability? When did we start knowing about conditional probabilities and joint probabilities? And the answer is incredibly late in the history of mankind. Well after Newton and Leibniz have invented the calculus, we're still struggling to understand the basics of probability. And that's totally mind-blowing to me, right? Because I figure, right, we've been gambling for centuries. We've been managing risk for centuries, right? Both of those things today are fundamentally driven by our ability to operate using probabilities, right? So the financial gain that could be held by being able to calculate, I mean, something as simple as, like, what's the probability of a set of dice rolls? What's the probability of a poker hand? And the idea that we didn't really get our act together until the 1700s is miraculous to me, right? Until you look at the kinds of equipment they were using. So these are the dice that we had in the 1500s and the 1600s, right? These were the kinds of sources of our randomness. And the problem is that these aren't particularly random objects. They're not the kind of reliable, precisely engineered sources of pure noise that you get, right, if you now go to Vegas or Sandia if you're in Santa Fe, right? The kinds of randomness people had access to were not pure in the sense that we would understand today. In fact, basically, gambling didn't look like this. It looked much more like this, right? And when you played a game of dice, the dice you knew had biases. And over the course of the game, you learned the bias. In fact, you were often playing sort of a meta game with somebody else when you were playing a game of dice, let's say. You weren't just sort of rolling it and both of you knowing that there was this sort of unpredictable object in the center of the table. When you were gambling with somebody else, you were sort of learning how to roll it, and then if you thought, okay, this guy's better at that piece of that die over there, so I'm going to kind of manipulate him into using that one. You're playing a metagame, basically trading off increasing levels of prediction over time. And so in fact, in order for the 15th century or the 16th century to solve the problem of probabilities, they actually had to do something that we didn't figure out until the 20th century, which is to realize that fundamentally, probabilities are not just facts about the world, but facts about our own minds. They're not just facts about, oh, this dice is really random. They're actually facts about, given how good I am at rolling this dice, given how familiar I am with my opponent, how predictable is the outcome of that interaction. We didn't actually figure out how to bring together the objective fact that we were trying to describe things in the world with the subjective facts that, depending on how good we are, how strong our computational abilities were, how much data we had, how much ability we had, how much familiarity we had, that those two things had to go together in order to have a full description of the way the world worked. And again, so this is true not only for gambling, but also for the insurance industry, right? So they knew when people were selling insurance for voyages in the 1600s, they knew, yes, there was some chance there was some randomness in that system, but they didn't think to use probabilities. They didn't think to develop that machinery because they knew, in part, it depended upon the skill of the pilot. It, in part, depended upon the political circumstances. That you couldn't actually have sort of a purely random ship voyage and measure the statistics on it. They knew fundamentally that you had to make a judgment about the individual person. And those judgments, they did not know how to formalize. And in fact, to be fair, we didn't understand until the 20th century that probability is actually a model of thinking, of how we understand the world. So I put this picture up when I teach to my students, right? Thinking is two things. Thinking is both what we as sort of ordinary human people do, right? Are there any Catholics in the room, right? This is the Mother Mary, right? She's just this ordinary human, right? On the left-hand side, right, this is the angelic sort of super being. And the bizarre thing is that actually we're better at describing the angelic super being, right, and her predictive abilities than we are at actually describing how ordinary people predict and perceive the world. This is the domain of psychology, and as we all know right now, there's some reproducibility crisis, so every time we look at the Virgin Mary, she does something different. It turns out, in fact, we actually have an optimal model of angelic reasoning. And that's what I'm going to tell you about today. We can, in fact, reverse engineer that angel. We had deductive logic from Aristotle before the birth of Christ. It took us until the 20th century to figure out how to do inductive logic, how to produce an optimal science of prediction. And in fact, the person I learned this from, at least his books, he was not around when I started reading them, is a man called E.T. Jaynes, a physicist, who showed us how the apparently deterministic rules of physics actually came from the subjective experience of the world around us. And I'll tell you how that works. So the key quantity that I'll be introducing you to today is uncertainty, sometimes called entropy, sometimes called information. And the best way to introduce you to it is through the game of 20 questions, sometimes called animal, vegetable, mineral. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you how to quantify your uncertainty about the world. And I'm going to use this game as an example. And in fact, this game will turn out to be everything. So do people know the game of 20 questions? Good. OK, Casey, will you play 20 questions with me? So what I'm going to do is I have something in mind. I'm thinking of something. And Casey can ask me yes/no questions, right, until she guesses what it is. But I can only answer yes or no. OK. I'm thinking of it, Casey.
Okay. Is it bigger than a bread box?
Yes.
Is it an animal?
Yes.
Is it furry?
No.
Does it have 4 legs?
Yes.
Does...
All right, so, so, OK, this is 20 questions. It turns out this was actually a game show in communist Poland. The communists were not good at game shows. The game show was shut down. This is a bit of a legend. I think this is true. It's a bit of a legend. The game show was shut down. So what they would do is they get like, oh, it's the plumbers union. Let's go play 20 questions, comrade. And then the mathematicians came. And the mathematicians showed up. And they said, all right, we are ready to play communist Poland 20 questions. And they're great. OK, great, go. And they said, OK, is the first letter of the word you're thinking of in the first half of the alphabet or the second half of the alphabet? OK, it's in the first half of the alphabet. OK, is the first letter of the word you're thinking of in the first half of the first alphabet or the second half of the first half of the alphabet? And in fact, with 20 questions, you can distinguish over 1 million different possibilities. Right? In fact, you're done actually much sooner than that. Right? And so then, of course, they had to cancel the game. Right? So the intuition here is that there are better sequences of questions to ask than others. In fact, the kinds of questions you should ask, the kinds of questions Casey should ask, depend upon her belief about what I'm thinking about. If Casey knows the things I'm constantly obsessed by and are more likely to be thinking about, it's better for her to conjecture, OK, it's probably in that space, probably thinking about, like, I don't know, dinosaurs again, right? And so an early question might be like Jurassic era or later, right? Here's a simple example of how to develop an optimal script, right? If Casey had angelic reasoning powers, even more angelic than the ones she already possesses. We'll take a simple case, right, where you're playing 20 questions against your dad, or your parental figure 1, right, guardian 1, okay? And to make it simple, let's say there's only 3 possibilities, right? Half the time when you play this game with your dad, he thinks about a car. A quarter of the time he thinks about a bird, and a quarter of the time he thinks about a tree. So if you want this game to be over as quickly as possible, what's the optimal first question to ask? Well done. OK. MIT, when I gave this lecture at MIT, they got it. Colorado did not get it. It was awkward, right? Yes, if it's a car, then you're done. You're done in one question, right? But if it's not a car, unfortunately, the game goes on. And you have to be like, OK, look, is it a bird? Actually, now you can ask, is it a bird or is it a tree, right? OK, is it a bird? Yes, it's a bird. In fact, at that point, since you know there are only 3 possibilities, right? So you know there are only 3 possibilities, whatever answer you get, you know the answer now. So on average, it takes 1.5 questions to win this game against your father if you played over and over and over again using this optimal script. Right? It turns out that we can figure out the average number of yes/no questions you need to ask to win the game without ever constructing the tree. We don't have to construct the tree in order to figure out how uncertain, how much information is inside your opponent's head. This is the sort of the key formula for all of information theory, all of statistical physics, right? If pi is the probability of word I, then pi log pi and summed over all the possibilities, and you always forget the minus sign, that's equal to the average number of yes/no questions you have to ask. It's not quite, there could be off by a fraction, but for now, we'll leave it at that. So this allows us, now that we're able to quantify how uncertain a distribution is, we can now start talking about whether one distribution, one set of possibilities, one mind is more or less uncertain than another, right? So if I'm always thinking about this set of objects here, but Casey is sort of more spread out over these ones, in general, it will take me more yes-no questions to finish a game against Casey than it will against me. If I, for example, always think of only one thing every time, the game is over in one. Okay? We can talk about whether one distribution or another is more or less uncertain. We can talk, in other words, about the entropy of a description. And then we can do the following move that happens in the physical sciences. I will not give you an example from physics. I will give you an example instead from economics. But I'll refer you to this idea, which I first saw in a beautiful book by C.P. Snow, who's a physicist but also a novelist. He wrote this book, The Light and the Dark. And he's talking here about the death of one of his characters. It's a beautiful novel. It's a beautiful character. The character is sort of this Wittgensteinian figure. In the course of the novel, the character sort of becomes disillusioned with life and takes on a very dangerous job during World War II, and he's killed. And C.P. Snow talks about what it would mean to describe or explain how that war went, how that war that killed his friend went. And instead of trying to produce an explanation, this is something that novelists sometimes try to do, right? Tolstoy in War and Peace. C.P. Snow talks about the Brownian movement of colonels and majors and captains. Right? The idea that most of life is disorder, most of life is unpredictable. And then, in fact, it turns out that that is the secret for most of 20th century physics. The maximum entropy principle says the following, right? In fact, maybe this is the most succinct way to say it. Everything is crap, right? Everything is jumbled and unpredictable and nonsensical, except that which by physical law cannot be broken. And what by physical law cannot be broken are just the conservation laws, so things like conservation of energy. David's example of Murray's discovery of a set of symmetries in the atom itself. There's a small number of constraints the world must obey. And then physics tells you that the world is maximally uncertain, maximally unpredictable, as long as it satisfies those constraints. It's the most disordered way to be a good physical system. So more pretentiously, if local interactions preserve the constraints and they are sufficiently disordered, they will lead to what's called the maximum entropy distribution. So find the distribution over states of the world that will take you the longest time to figure out through a series of yes-no questions. So here's my example. It's an economic example about the island utopia. So I give this now to my students. I say, look, imagine I locked you all in this room and I gave you $100 in quarters. And I said, go like invent a society, survive, right? Good luck, right? And then I came back later, right? And whatever they had done, they'd done something. Maybe some people even got killed, who knows, right? But they had done something, and then I want to know, what's the distribution of wealth in that society? After they've been doing whatever it is they figured out to do, all of their trading, all of their interactions. Oh, like you have a banana, well, I don't know, I'll give you some of these quarters for that banana. What would that distribution look like? Well, here we're going to make an assumption. We're going to say, look, coins can neither be created nor destroyed. That's our constraint in the system. Right? No coins can leave. You can't like destroy a coin. But otherwise, the society will be maximally disordered. So here's the space of all possible sort of distributions of wealth. So imagine on this grid here, or sorry, on this plane, each point is a description of who owns what. This sort of blue circle here contains all the descriptions such that the total amount of money in the room still adds up to $100. Right? And then over time, basically the history of that little island world is a path through this space staying entirely within the blue area. Right? It can't, if it were to leave the blue area, that would mean somebody had like swallowed a coin or something. It's not allowed. Coins are conserved. So it wanders around the blue area. And what we want is we want the probability distribution over that blue area to be the maximum entropy distribution, to have the highest entropy of all the possible ones. So for example, if it was just focused here, if all of the trading happened kept into this little constraint here, that's not as high entropy as if it had spread out over the entire plane, over the entire blue circle. Turns out we can actually write that down. formally. It's really simple. It's an exponential distribution, right? The probability that an arbitrary person plucked from that island utopia will have wealth W, sort of endowment W, right, is equal to e to the negative beta W divided by z, and this is just a normalization constant. Right? And then all you have to do is twiddle beta to get the correct amount of total money, right? So if I told you there's $100 in the room, and I tell you how many people there are, all you have to do is find the value of beta such that when you sum up all the different probabilities and average them, you get $100 on average. Okay. So it says, in other words, the physics prediction for how much money people have will follow this exponential. Here is, I don't know if the United Kingdom is an island utopia anymore, but let us say it is. It is now, right? In fact, this model works extremely well, right? Certainly above sort of 250 pounds a week income, right? And this is income, but works the same for wealth. For most people, right, that's the exponential distribution. It fits remarkably well. Now, something crazy happens out here, right? Or I guess sort of more out here, right, for the super wealthy. But in fact, for most people, you can basically model England or Britain as just people sort of randomly trading money with each other. All of our complicated social things that we do, you know, especially you guys do, right? All of the complicated rituals and, oh, I got a professional qualification, oh, you know, like I got this new job. All of that basically is sufficiently disordered, sufficiently unpredictable that if I go out onto the street right now and pull someone off the street and say, how much money do you make, sir? Right? It will in fact follow this distribution. Now there's one deviation, which is right down here. Okay, so below 250 pounds a week, thank you, below 250 pounds a week, it doesn't work anymore. And the basic reason is this is government statistics, right? So there's a lot of money being made under the table here, right? And so that's not getting reported, right? That's the basic assumption, right? So in fact, there's a lot more being made here. We just don't have the ability to track it. In fact, the hardest bit of testing all these theories is actually figuring out how much money people have, because they turn out to be sensitive about it when you ask. Okay. So what I've shown you here, I've given you an example of how to quantify the uncertainty of a distribution, right? 20 questions with Casey, right? And if Casey were angelic, right, she'd have the optimal set of questions, and she could tell me, like, your entropy is like 5 bits or something, right? Another example, and this is something that came up, I believe David mentioned this one, no, Doan did, is a relationship between unpredictability and compressibility. And in fact, if I take a piece of text, I build a model of it, and I ask how uncertain is the output of that model, that's actually equivalent to how much I can compress the original text all the way down. So if, for example, I take a file, I make a text file, and I just make it entirely A's. I just type A over and over and over and over again. The uncertainty in that file is 0. The probability of getting anything else other than an A is 0. Right? So the probability of A is 1, and 1 log 1 is 0, it turns out. And so in fact, I can compress that file all the way down. But as I add more disorder to it, as I make the file more unpredictable, it gets harder and harder to compress. And you could just literally test this out by using gzip or zip on your computer. Make a file that's more or less predictable and try to compress it. All right, Jane Austen. How unpredictable is Jane Austen? Let's say I stick my hand into Pride and Prejudice and pull out a word. What's the uncertainty? How many yes-no questions does Angelic Casey need to figure out what the word is? So she can ask any set of questions. She's going to ask the optimal one. How many yes-no questions on average will she need for Jane Austen? You really want to say, David? Come on. 10. You're so good. It's good. Jesus, it's good. It's really good. 9 bits on average. On average, 9 yes-no questions. Now, actually, that's really small if you think about it, because 9 yes-no questions distributed over an even number of options means, in fact, 512 words, if she used each word equally often, right? Okay, so that doesn't quite make sense until you realize that, in fact, human language is incredibly predictable because most of it is this junky filler, right? So, great opening line of Pride and Prejudice, totally famous, right? It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife, right? Unforgettable, but actually most of it is just this crap like it is a, that a, in of a, must be in of a. Most of it is like a small collection of words, right? The unpredictability that we respond to, and that's the difference, of course, between Mary and the Archangel Gabriel. Okay, quick science. So that's Jane Austen. Her entropy is 9 bits. This is Virginia Woolf. What's the entropy of To the Lighthouse? Higher or lower? 8.5. It's almost exactly the same. Now, what's interesting here, of course, different scripts, right? Motor car does not appear in Jane Austen, right? Different sets of words, but the total uncertainty is actually the same. I did this for the Danish when I went to Denmark. We'll skip over it. Turns out the Danish, word by word, has slightly more entropy just because it's inflected, right? The Danes stick things on the end of their word to make them do different things, right? So it's in the accusative case, the genitive case, right? We don't do that. So when I stick my hand into a Danish book, like either or, right, out the other side, I not only have to guess the word, but I also have to guess its case. And in fact, that ends up being an extra half a question. It turns out Sanskrit is the most information-dense word-by-word language I've been able to find. So it's an extra 1.7 questions. OK, so once I have a notion of uncertainty, I have a notion of predictability. Because I can talk about how uncertain I am about something, right? How many yes-no questions I need. But then I can also talk about how uncertain I am about something given knowledge of something else, right? So you tell me something about the system, right? So like, OK, we're going to play 20 questions against Simon, but I'll give you a clue. It's in the morning, and it's like he's probably thinking about breakfast. So knowing that signal, knowing that fact about me, reduces your uncertainty. And in fact, on average, learning never hurts. Your uncertainty about something will never go up on average when you learn more facts about it. Sometimes your uncertainty can go up, right? So if I know, like, oh, what's the next talk going to be, right? I have some uncertainty about the subject, and then they're like, by the way, it's David Krakauer. And I'm like, oh, Christ, now I have no idea. So in that case, by learning that fact, OK, I'm actually more uncertain. But on average, if I average over everyone in the room, for every kind of super unpredictable person like David, there's a very predictable person. And you can't trick me into naming names. But on average, the uncertainty about X will be greater than my uncertainty about X, given that I know Y. And so now we can do the following. We can say, OK, look, my uncertainty about word and Pride and Prejudice. But now let's say I know the word just before. So I draw 2 words out. I look at the first one, and I tell you that word. And then you have to guess the second one. Now your uncertainty goes way down. Instead of 9 yes-no questions, you only need 5.5, 5.4. So for example, I'm like, OK, pull it out like, oh, first word is the. Well, now you've got no verbs allowed, right? So you cut out a whole bunch of questions. Okay. Take the difference. This is called the mutual information. The mutual information of consecutive words, how much one word predicts the next, is 3.65 bits. This is now predictability. Okay? Right? Quick science. So entropy of Jane Austen is 9 bits. Entropy of Virginia Woolf is 9 bits. The mutual information of Jane Austen is 3.65 bits. Is the mutual information between words in Virginia Woolf higher or lower than in Pride and Prejudice? Lower. Top of the class. It is lower. Right? In fact, significantly lower. The uncertainty of a word is about the same in the 2 texts. But the uncertainty about the next word is much higher. Another way to say it is this is what it means to be modernist, right? The word that's going to come next in the sentence is less predictable. Jane Austen's prose is more predictable word to word, right? A word on its own is equally unpredictable in the 2 texts, but Jane is sticking more signals in for you to hear. This is a much more jagged and unpredictable text. OK, competitive prediction, right? So now I've taught you how to think about uncertainty. I've shown you how physicists used uncertainty, and in fact, how we did some economics, right? Then I talked about uncertainty in a social world. 5 minutes, thank you. Talked about uncertainty in a social world. And then, in fact, I talked about the strength of signals. And I showed you that we could understand Jane Austen as being equally uncertain word by word as Virginia Woolf, but that Jane Austen is also making her text predictable within the sentence itself. OK, so competitive prediction, right? Say you're playing a game against somebody, right? OK, we're not going to do Go, right? Because Go, it turns out, is so incredibly complicated that it's equivalent to a game of chess where each move in that game is actually itself a game of chess. And each move in that nested game is a game of chess. And there's actually a game of checkers hidden inside, right? Go is an incredibly complicated game. We've only just cracked it. So instead, I'm going to talk about rock, paper, scissors. Okay? So I'm going to throw out this lovely aspect of the prediction problem, which is the computational challenge. Rock, paper, scissors, we have solved. We know the optimal strategy, play randomly. Because if you think about it, right, if you have a strategy other than play randomly, you're like, I got a great one. Play rock early. Okay, well, I'm sorry, I've just cracked your strategy because now I can play paper early, right? So that's the optimal strategy, right? By the way, in the real world, if you ever play rock, paper, scissors, it turns out men lead with rock. So if you ever have to play in a critical moment, my recommendation, especially if you're playing against a man, because they think it's like a strong, like, rock. Gotcha. Lead with paper, right? You have a little bit of an edge. Okay. So I guess that's a preview for what we're going to find. So I really miss the Institute, but one thing that I get as a professor is I get to do experiments on my students. You usually have to fill out forms when you do this because people did all kinds of awful experiments, like get them to pretend to be concentration camp guards. And I'm terrible at filling out forms. And so instead, it turns out you can do experiments without the forms as long as it's for their educational benefit. So I had my students play rock, paper, scissors against each other. And I had them take data. So they got in groups of 3, and 2 of them played rock, paper, scissors. The other one took the data. And then we took all the data from the class. We had 40 students, so we had 20 pairs, and they played a lot of rock, paper, scissors for like the whole hour because I thought it would be very educational. And then what I can do is I can measure how often what the win rate of a student is compared to their overall unpredictability, right? The win rate for optimal random play, like the sort of Nash equilibrium win rate, is 33%, 1/3, right? If we're both playing randomly, in fact, whatever David's playing, whatever strategy he's playing, if I'm playing randomly, right, if I pick rock, paper, or scissors equally, then 1/3 of the time I'll win, 1/3 of the time he'll win, and 1/3 of the time we'll draw. Okay? And what you see is that there are some people who are persistently better than others, and in fact, there's not really much of a correlation with the uncertainty of the player's move. In fact, for example, this player here, move by move, was actually one of the most predictable. And yet that student did very well. So what's going on? It turns out that, in fact, the secret here is not in the individual predictability of each move, but in the signals that the player sends. Just like the difference between Jane Austen and Virginia Woolf, a good player, a player who wins a lot, right, who has a high win rate, has lower mutual information from one round to the next. It is the players who are less predictable given the history of the game, and in fact, in this case, just given the one-step history, those are the ones that do the best, right? So this is like, this is prediction company, this is prediction company and Rentech, right? These are the sharks, right? And these are the fish, and what separates the sharks from the fish is the mutual information from one round to the next, how predictable they are. The players who end up being predictable are the ones the sharks can take advantage of. Okay, so I have a little bit of time. I'm going to skip this great thing. We can talk about Hamlet. We're going to talk about Hamlet, if you like, in the questions. But instead, since this came up, I'm going to talk about the distances between distributions, which again can be phrased in an information theoretic fashion, right? So I've talked about, okay, I have some distribution over words. How uncertain is it? Oh, I have some pattern in how I use words. So if you know what word I've just used, how certain are you about the word that's going to come next? You understood that? Okay. Now we're going to talk about the use of external signals, right? And so I did this work for some colleagues in Sussex. I'll give you the American example as well. But let's imagine, right, that you're reading election manifestos, right? So every election, right, the different political parties come out with a manifesto that sort of says what we as a party believe, right? What does it mean to vote for us? Okay. And so in fact, we have, thanks to the political scientists, data going all the way back now to the 1940s, and we can ask questions like this, right? We can take a manifesto. So I'm going to read this manifesto to you, and I want you to tell me, is this Labour or Conservative? Those are your two options, Labour Party or Conservative Party. Britain needs a new economic model. Labour or Conservative? Saving and business investment must replace reckless borrowing as the foundation of growth. Labour or Conservative now? Right, okay. So what you're doing is you're picking up on signals in this text, right? Okay, new economic model. Yeah, everyone's got a new economic model these days, right? But reckless borrowing. Okay, yeah, and it turns out that's the Conservative Manifesto. It's a passage from the 2010 Conservative Manifesto. Here's another one. Okay, and you can see it's a little older, right? Where shall the money come from? I wish I had a good sort of accent for this. Where shall the money come from? Some of it will come from those oil revenues now pouring down the drain. Some of it will come from the billions we waste on the dole queues. Some of it will come from the billions now being allowed to be exported and investment abroad. Yes, and some of it will be borrowed. Mrs. Thatcher's dirty word. Right? Good luck winning that election, Labour, in 1983. Okay? So the story here is that people create signals, right? Jane Austen is creating signals. Virginia Woolf is creating signals and then selectively destroying them, right? What we see in political parties is, of course, the same thing, the use of signals, right? And what, of course, signals allow us to do is to reduce our uncertainty about who we're voting for, right? The more signals I give you, like if I go into a bar and I hear someone talk about reckless borrowing, I'm like, okay, it's a Conservative Party member. When it's funny, when I gave this talk, by the way, to the academics at Sussex, and I read this, right? You guys said Conservative, right? They sort of, these academics were like, Tory, right? And the reason I said Tory is, of course, the word Tory is now a signal of being a left-winger. The Tory Party, the Conservative Party, doesn't use the word Tory anymore. So we're constantly creating these signals. Here's a history of the distinctiveness of the party manifestos over time. So here's sort of the strength of the signal, right? So I hear a word. This is just the one-word predictor. I hear a word from a manifesto. Okay, sometimes not very used, like the. Well, both parties do use the definite article, right? But sometimes I hear a word like borrow, or I hear a word like crime, or NHS, or children, right? And those are actually stronger and stronger signals that reduce my uncertainty about which party it is. So here it is. Here's the history from 1960, right? It's kind of fluctuating. This is an interesting moment here. This was in the mid-'70s when they actually had to have sort of two elections right after the other. They couldn't quite get a majority. They held an election right away. And you can see the distinctiveness of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party went down, right? The signals, right, that distinguished them, some of them were taken out.
Yeah. You're looking at the divergence between the probability distribution that describe word frequencies.
Yes.
Single word frequencies.
Single word. This is the 1 gram. Yeah, exactly. All right, so here we are, and I have selectively cut it off at the beginning of the 1990s. What do you think happens to the distinguishability, the strength of these signals, the predictability of these manifestos in the 1990s? What happens? Boom, New Labour, right? And the lowest point, the least distinguishable, in fact, in the entire 20th century, second half of the 20th century for New Labour is right there in that major election. In fact, it actually starts in 1992, so they're already selectively aligning themselves. And of course, what we have here, this is from the lovely talk we had earlier, right? If this is the Conservative Party and this is the Labour Party, they've gotten closer together, but there's different ways to get close together, right? You can bring the mountain to Muhammad, or you can bring the Muhammad to the mountain, right? In this case, it turns out what happens is not they get closer because the Labour Party is going, coming over here and just kind of grabbing a couple signals. Right? Then, in fact, what's interesting is it actually goes back up again. Right? Then they win their majority, and actually now the parties are starting to use more distinctive language. Here is the same plot for the distinguishability, right? The predictability of the party given the language over time in the US system. And you can see, okay, the most distinctive, I haven't done Trump yet. Okay, I know, you all want to know, I haven't done Trump yet. The most distinctive is that early point there in the 1960s. Anyone know what that point is? Yes, right? The nuttiest, second nuttiest candidate that I know of in the American political scene. And then, okay, what happens over here? Right? What's going on here? Right? That's New Labour for the Americans, otherwise known as the Reagan era. Right? Reagan swoops in and takes all the Reagan Democrats. Right? And the way, of course, that he's done it, right, is by taking all of their signals. We can overlay these. This is kind of fun. This is just a little fun last point here. Right? We can overlay the strengths, the predictability of the two systems on top of each other, and we can say things like the following, right? In the Reagan era, right, for the Americans, less polarized than the Thatcher era. In fact, this was a point where the Republicans and the Democrats, they were the least distinguishable from each other. Meanwhile, this is sort of this angry, like poll tax riots, all this crap happening in the 80s, right? That's where the parties are the furthest apart in Britain. And in fact, it flips. So the Clinton era, far more polarized, right, than the New Labour era. So what have I done here? I'm happy to take questions. I've walked you through a story about how randomness is not about the material world. In the end, everything's predictable, okay? Quantum randomness is also not really random, okay? Doan's not here, right? Everything's predictable. That's fine. My computer sees me as a source of randomness because it doesn't know me. It only knows itself, right? So it can use me as a source of randomness. And in fact, this was the challenge. That's why it took us so long to figure out probabilities, because that's the way the world works, right? Randomness is not outside, it's inside. I walked you through a model of how we talk about probabilities and the key quantity, which is the unpredictability of the world. I used that to give a physics example, how to describe the income distribution in the United Kingdom. Okay, yeah, we're leaving off the extreme Piketty stuff, right? We're just talking about like normal sort of, doctors and nurses and lawyers and Uber drivers, right? I walked you through now not just uncertainty, but predictability, signaling structure. I talked about the competitive signaling structure that happens, where the people who are more predictable get eaten by the people who are less predictable. And then finally, I walked you through the creation and, in some cases, destruction of signals in a social system. All right. Well, thank you. I have gone over. Will, I was terrified, but I'm more afraid of the English than I am of a fellow American, so it was okay. And I'd love to take questions. And Will, can you MC so we don't go over? That's the other thing. Thank you. Yes, John.
I understand that the long-term trend, in the US at least, is for elections to be getting closer, ever closer.
Yes.
Because both sides have better and better data about what people are thinking, what they want to hear, and you want to optimize the use of your funds. So ideally, you want to get 51% of the vote. And I don't know, it seems somewhat related to this point of the divergence between the language of the two. Maybe the long-term trend is for it to be declining?
Yes, and it's absolutely, that's exactly the trend. We've run this for some of the major European countries. One of the reasons we're really interested in it is because, amazingly, far right-wing neo-Nazi parties are winning elections in Europe right now. So the Austrians almost had a neo-Nazi president. It went down to the postal votes against the Green Party. And they want to understand, where the hell are these guys coming from? And in fact, if you look in the European system, right, here it's a little more jagged, right? The US, UK, a little more jagged. But in general, there is a downward trend. And if you go to, for example, Denmark, so I ran this for the Danes have the Danish People's Party. And their ads are really funny. They're sort of like, it's just a photograph of a family. And you're like, I'm not Jewish, but I was like, I gotta get out of here, right? It's like, even the dog is blonde, right? So Danish People's Party, where does it come from? Right? If you look at the center left and the center right distinguishability, like the mainstream parties, their signals have gotten increasingly indistinct from each other. But the overall predictability of the system is actually maintained because these extreme parties come in. So the average unpredictability is actually quite high. The mainstream parties are getting closer together, and on both the left and the right, these people are jumping in. And so one of the things that people say, for example, about Trump, is like, oh, it's great, he says things you're not allowed to say. The way to say it is he's using signals that we no longer use, right? Trump is actually restoring some kind of signal diversity to the system. The only problem is in the American case, right, the parties can't split because of the logic of the winner-takes-all case in America, right? But in the European case, as the center parties get closer together, these other ones, right, kind of split off on either side. So it's a great question, John, and I think it's exactly to the point.
Simon, with deep apologies to do this to you in the room so late in the day.
I'm terrified.
Hey, just help me. I think I've heard you say everything is predictable.
Yaha.
But I'm not getting that. I can't quite follow all of this. So
Yeah.
So you've told us that there is a deep amount of structure. But there seems to be randomness too, and so can I just ask you, where are you leaving me by the time I get to beer o'clock?
So Doan is right? All unpredictability is in you. It's your ignorance of the world that produces an inability to predict what's going to happen next. Now, one thing I am leaving out here, and this is something the point David made, right, is there's also the computational problems, right? So in fact, Go is sort of totally predictable. We can actually just, if we just looked at all possible games, we know how to play Go. We can't do that for computational reasons. So we'll put that aside for a second. Limits on that side for prediction. But all the other limits on prediction come from ignorance, right? The machine, right, if the machine could predict me, then it would not consider my inputs to be a source of randomness, right? If Casey knew what I was thinking ahead of time, right, then there would be no unpredictability in me. But because she doesn't, she just knows I have biases. I'm more likely to say this than that. She can now quantify exactly how unpredictable I am. But her unpredictability comes from ignorance about what's in my head. She might be able to get some signals from me, right, some kind of tells, right? She could prime it, like show me pictures of food and then play 20 questions, and she'll know, like, oh, he's probably more on the food side. So I become less unpredictable to her, right? But that was the big challenge, right? The challenge was to realize that, in fact, predictability in general is internal. It's a subjective state. And so all of this here is talking about, for example, right, once I know one word in Virginia Woolf, the next word becomes more predictable. Right? So predictability is changing, but nothing in the text is always the same text. It's just what I know. Is that helpful?
Very helpful. Can you help me with the unpredictability of you as the subject and Casey as the examiner? Is the randomness in Casey or in you or both? Or?
So, I mean, we're playing 20 questions,
yeah.
right? So, someone who doesn't know me, right, will have a different set of beliefs about the things I'm likely to choose, right? And that different set of beliefs will, in general, make me appear to be more unpredictable, right? So it will take them a long time to guess that I'm thinking of the words, I don't know, complexity, right? But because Casey knows me, right, Casey has more information, right? So I appear to her to be more predictable than to someone else.
So the randomness is in the examiner or the observer of reality, the system, whatever we...
The failure to predict, the perceived unpredictability, is in the examiner, exactly. And I will also add another caveat here. This is true for the angel. We don't know how real Casey works. We just know how angelic Casey works. We don't actually know what she's doing. We can talk instead about how an optimal version would behave. Now, when we try to do social behavior, that's problematic. When we do machine learning, a lot of our machines at this point are actually operating at that optimal angelic boundary given the data that they have. Right? Another way to say it is most of our AI algorithms these days are at least partly Bayesian. So that's the other caveat there, is this story, all of this kind of fits together. I'm able to plot these. I can't actually tell you what it feels like to read a Labour Party manifesto. I can tell you how good an angelic operator using just those bits of information would be at distinguishing them. So I still have to use that kind of theoretical optimum. In the end, what I'm doing is I'm placing upper bounds on actual agents. Oh, yes. Oh, God, doomed.
So I want to ask about the bottom right plot.
Yep.
Because there's an assumption in there, right? And that is that human beings, when they read, are highly responsible to single tokens, to single words.
Yes.
If you do the same analysis based on diagrams or topics, what does it look like? Do you know?
Yes. So I actually do know. We've done a couple of bits of this. It turns out that if you do topics, that actually the numbers change, but actually it still works. So we get the same curve, which is very satisfying. Yeah, which is really nice. The Americans at this point, we've been so optimized, as John was sort of maybe suggesting, we've been so optimized. In fact, Americans have already gone to diagrams. So we don't talk about, we don't have like Tory versus conservative. We have words like tax cut versus tax relief, right? Americans will talk about, okay, so here's an example. Small business, Republican or Democrat? Republican, right? Working families is the code on the other side. So the Americans have actually gone to these two-word signals. Turns out, at least as far as we've seen, most of the distinguishing information is actually at the one-word level for the British so far, at least in the British system. And again, only using the Labour Party and the Conservative Party for efficiency. But yeah, these are actually, the question David is asking is like, where are the signals stored, right? And if, for example, when we take the case of Virginia Woolf, we're looking at one word to the next, but of course our experience of that text is not just, right? We have sort of a holistic view, right? We're using a whole bunch of signals. So when we talk about the avant-garde being less predictable, we do have a certain model of reading. Are there any other questions?
Do you know if anyone's using this whole Jensen-Shannon divergence approach to try and identify like segmentations in markets or segmentations in investment strategies based on the prospectus that people might put out?
I have a student working on it. A student did a class project on it, and so yeah, it works, right? And for example, he was able to figure out to sort of segment markets into these I don't know anything about finance, right? It's like there's the energy stocks, right, and we have the other stock, like these stocks partition, and what he was able to do is segment them by the patterns of up and down, conditional upon external information. So how similar the two patterns are of behavior and response, right? Those ones go close together, and you put that on a big map, sort of like the influenza map now, right? But instead, now you can see the stocks tend to segregate into these separate markets, which makes sense. To a certain extent, that's something that we've been able to do with other methods as well. In that case, because the patterns, at least the patterns people often play with in the market, are very simple. They're generally linear correlations. So, for example, when Dome was showing off the Predco ability, right, he was basically just looking at linear correlations. What's nice about these here, right, about information theory, is that it works in sort of an arbitrary space. Right? It's not like, oh, if the word is longer, the next word's also going to be longer. It's not, putting some kind of assumption of that covariance in. It's looking for any possible patterns. That's kind of a lovely feature of information theory. Yes, in the back.
Again, talking about the political element there, do you find that as we have seen sort of a resurgence in the extremism as you have throughout history of political parties, and you find some of the guys that, as they've converged, the main ones, that they try and talk to some of the extreme as well, and they might throw in the odd nod within a main manifesto. Does that neutralize the main message, or what is the impact, because they're trying to offset that tail risk, I guess?
Right. So one of the things. So for example, if we take the Reagan era, right, 1980. So the official political manifestos for the two parties in 1980 were very similar, or they were the most similar that we had seen in the entire data, right? A way to say that is like Reagan is looking like a Democrat, he's looking centrist. Now we also know that he's going out and giving speeches in the southern states using all sorts of coded language about states' rights, and like he's sending a lot of signals that are not going into the big manifesto because he's trying to conceal them, right? And so this is a story about a certain channel. Right? And in this particular highly official channel, this is what this distinctiveness is. Now, there are also other channels that are happening, other channels of communication. In the US system, right, what's kind of amazing about Trump is that he's taken, okay, this is now just to kind of help you understand information theory, not to write a paper in political science, right? What Trump has done is take some of the signals and put them into the main channel, right? So he's not saying things necessarily that have never been said before by members of his party. What's remarkable is that he's now putting them into information channels that they have never appeared in, like on CNN and in party manifestos. So I think that's part of what's happening in the U.S. case. This is, information is not everything, right? This is what people say. And in fact, even as, for example, the political rhetoric in Europe has gone up, in fact, the levels of sort of actual physical violence have gone down. So what we're looking at here is how people communicate, not necessarily what they do in response to what they're saying.
So can you say that last sentence again, about the incidents going down?
Right. So one of the questions we had in the European case was like, oh, look at these far right parties. They're very scary, and it's true, right? They're using signals that many people find disturbing, right? But it's also safe to say that despite the fact that those signals are there, the actual levels, let's say, of violence against immigrants have gone down and are going down across Europe for the last 50 years. So that's a separate story. Behavior is not signal. There's another way of saying it.
So for example, it's been all over the UK press, it might just be sensationalism that post-Brexit vote, that there's been a resurgence in hate crime, whatever, but you would suggest that's not actually real data, that's just sensationalism and press?
Yes. And so I'm going to be very careful here. I don't know the UK story. I do know the story in the United States right now is there's a feeling that violence against police has gone up. In fact, it's been going down month on month for the last 40 years.
Hey, Simon, sorry, you're not saying that people are lying. You're just saying that the
information that you get from political manifestos and so on,
Yeah.
that is something different to behavior, whereas I think
Yep.
the data that was reported after the Brexit was actual data. So in the press it was reported that there were more violent incidents. So this is a completely different thing.
Yeah, no. I mean, you were asking the question, what about this? So my answer, to be very careful, is I don't know about the UK case. I do know right now that in the United States there is a talk of an increase in physical violence that doesn't seem to be borne out by the data there. And it's partly just the salience, it's partly the interpretation of random events. But that's a separate conversation, perhaps, than the sort of really clear story I think we have about not what the parties, not what the people are doing, but what they're saying.
Okay. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much.